Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Geopolitical Futures podcast. I'm Cole. With me again is Jacob and Phil. How are y'all doing over there?
Good.
I'm in a profoundly bad mood, Cole.
I know that's generally true. I also know because I look at your Twitter feed that you had a bit of a minor meltdown yesterday. Why don't you tell everybody about it?
Look, I hate those podcasts where they take forever to get into the thing that they're supposed to be talking about, or when they're advertising some new underwear company or something like that. But I have to take this moment and this platform for 25 seconds to say, as a former Atlanta Hawks fan, I apologize to the country of Slovenia for us trading Luka Doncic to Dallas. That was one of the dumbest things I've ever seen happen in my entire life. And if you want to understand how smart men and smart women can make mistakes, just look at what just happened in the NBA draft. Unbelievable. The right thing is clear in front of your face, as clear as day, and you screw it up. And this is a lesson that countries and individuals, and especially Atlanta Hawks executives, should really take to heart.
All right, you got it all out?
You feel better?
Yeah, I'm good. What are we going to talk about now?
I thought we were going to talk more about the draft. I mean, I could talk about the Spurs for a while if we need to.
No, we should. Let's
Okay.
let's get on to the show.
Okay. Well, speaking of old and decrepit organizations, we're going to talk about NATO today.
Ooh, low blow.
Yeah, I know. Well, so the reason, Jacob, actually, this was sort of your idea, and you kind of sit around the article. So if you wanna bring everybody up to speed on it, we certainly can.
Yeah, it's a very simple premise. The head of NATO, the Secretary General, is what they call the leader of NATO, wrote an op-ed for The Guardian. Why they picked The Guardian, I'm still not sure. Maybe somebody at some point can illuminate me on why they chose The Guardian. Would you choose The Guardian to announce a major decision in your life?
I haven't had a major decision in my life yet, but if I ever do, maybe I'll keep him in mind. But it was written, as you said, by Jens Stoltenberg, former Norwegian Prime Minister, current Secretary General of NATO, friend of the show, I'm sure. And it was really a cry for help, right?
It wasn't even a cry for help. It got a lot of sensationalist media coverage. Oh my God, the Secretary of General of NATO is saying that NATO is going down. He wasn't saying that, but it was striking because he was saying, look, there are some problems within NATO. We've got different interests between the countries that are part of this. And he was writing the article saying he thought that they could be overcome. But still, you had the Secretary General of NATO saying out loud, look, the future of NATO is not a foregone conclusion. We have to think about how to get over some of these issues. So what I proposed we would come together and talk about is, what is NATO's future? It might lead us down an interesting path.
Yeah, I mean, I think what he was getting at was post Cold War, the great unifying impetus for NATO's existence has gone away, and leading it to become sort of this still valuable but organization that doesn't have this immediate threat that sort of forces countries to look beyond their immediate differences or tactical disagreements or so forth. And without that big sexy thing out there that forces everyone to come together, it is easy over time for things to languish, for countries to stop putting in the resources that they've promised to in the terms of European defense spending. All that's fine. It's still pretty valuable to be working out those interoperability issues and keeping the infrastructure intact for a future where there might be a major threat again. But the problem with that is then someone comes along like Donald Trump, who doesn't think hard alliances are particularly worthwhile, that he thinks they're a drain on U.S. resources. And that all of a sudden puts everything in stark relief that you can't just assume this age-old structure that has helped preserve the peace and help sort of stabilize this continent that has previously continuously been at war. You can't assume that it'll just be around forever.
Well, true enough. But let's take a step back though and talk some specifics. All right, we all know that NATO was basically created to combat the Soviet Union and communism. Now, with all due respect to the nominally communist states still in existence, Vietnam, Laos, that's not really an issue anymore, as you said. But what has it done since the fall of the Soviet Union? Let's itemize some of these things to kind of assess what its value is.
I was going to say just two things, but now I'm going to say three things based on what you just said, Cole. And I'm not actually going to answer your question, but I think it's going to be interesting. The first thing is that as we've been talking about this, you already can feel some of the ambiguity because we've called it an organization and a bureaucracy and a this, that, or the other thing. NATO is a military alliance, period. It's supposed to be a military alliance designed to keep the Soviet Union in check. That was the goal. It became communism, became the ideological valence that went along with all this. But we're talking in terms of hard power. We're talking about a dominant Russian entity that looked like it was about to dominate Europe, and you had a military alliance against it. The question that Philip sort of posed there is, he said there's not this one big sexy thing. The question of whether NATO has a future is really, does NATO have a unified enemy? And the problem right now is that Russia, A, is not strong enough to be that unified enemy, right? And B, different countries in the bloc have different ideas about how to contain it. So I would actually push back against you, Philip, when you say that Trump has no use for military alliances. I don't think that's really true. I think Trump has use for military alliances that pay dividends to the United States' strategic interests. That's why the United States under Trump has strengthened its relationships with Poland, with Romania. The issue here is that now you don't need NATO to contain Russia. All you need is a couple key relationships with Eastern European states. You have the United States and Germany seeing the world differently. Turkey's role in NATO is especially ambiguous. It's not really clear what these countries are supposed to be doing for each other and what the threshold is for activating the military alliance components of it. So I know I've been talking for a second, I'm long-winded, but Cole, to circle it back on your question, what has NATO accomplished since 1991? Well, it's gone together and done some stuff in the Balkans.
Yeah, the Balkans War was like, it was like NATO's Woodstock, basically. That was like the first time they were like truly tested, and they were actually useful. It was like a big party for them. But yeah, I mean, to your point, they've done missions in Afghanistan. They've done Libya, right? They participated in a bunch of bombing campaigns there, and anti-piracy operations, things like that. So,
well, the most effective military alliance is the military alliance that doesn't have to fire a shot. And that's what NATO was. From 1945 to 1991, NATO was an incredible military alliance. The Soviet Union collapsed. It won the battle. And then afterwards, you got the spasm of NATO trying to figure out what was this military alliance supposed to do once the Soviet Union wasn't there anymore. And the amazing thing about bureaucracies, because the military alliance did spawn a bureaucracy, is that they keep going on over time. And you see NATO trying to mold itself into something that is relevant. And the real question, I really think the real question is, do these countries have a common enemy?
So let me just clarify what I was saying on Trump. I don't think that he doesn't value international relationships or allies or anything like that. What he's wary of, and maybe rightfully, is being locked into these big sclerotic multilateral institutions that sort of facilitate bandwagoning on U.S. strength and so forth. He's also expressed skepticism about bilateral alliances as well, in terms of anything that sort of ties the U.S. into something that it may not, that ends up being sort of a draining relationship, or putting the U.S. at risk of having to go to war over something that's not particularly in its interest. Again, I'm not saying that's not rational or there's not sound thought to that. To defend the big sclerotic alliance in Europe, I will say that, like, I think Robert Kaplan put it, a few years ago. He's like, it's okay. Basically, made the argument that it's okay if NATO turns into something that has just sort of an ordinary future, or it has becomes an ordinary alliance. For all its inefficiencies and for all its lack of strategic coherence, if the big threat reemerges, it's really hard to lay that groundwork for a functional alliance quickly. You need the interoperability stuff worked out in advance. You need the division of forces. You need familiarity. You need decision-making structures, command structures, all that. You can't be laid down overnight or within a few years. And they've, for all its faults, it has been pretty effective at honing these things over several decades. And secondly, and I'm kind of playing devil's advocate here, but you could argue that the potential for NATO to return to its past glory has deterred, let's say, Russia from being more aggressive, particularly in, say, the Baltics or somewhere. Without the structure in place that could grow into something meaningful, it's not that hard to imagine a scenario where Russia would have been far more aggressive in Eastern Europe, despite its internal weaknesses.
Well, I think what I was going to say too, supposing you're right about everything, is it only true for traditional state actors, state militaries, right? So NATO has all this interoperability, and it has these alliance structures in place and all the infrastructure, like you said. Does that only work if you're going against Russia or if you're going against China? Because I mean, they invoked Article 5 after 9/11. and you could, I mean, reasonable people can argue about how successful it was in participating in the global war on terror or whatever. Do you see it actually working against non-traditional enemies or insurgent forces, things like that?
I mean, I think they've had trouble so far to the extent that the Balkans wars or NATO's intervention in Afghanistan or Libya were successful was really because of the U.S., which as always carried by far the biggest burden, provided the most firepower, logistic support, and so forth. So I mean, really what you're talking about is, can the U.S. be successful here with some help from some friends? In terms of the big thing that NATO provides it in Europe is that by being so large, which makes it unwieldy, it provides it strategic depth on the Eastern Front. And you don't want to see it be in a situation, if you're the US or Western Europe, to see these Eastern Central Europe start getting peeled away. But that's not what you're asking. You're asking, is it good at the smaller stuff, the Middle East? And its record's been mixed at best.
The reason its record has been missed is because there isn't a unified sense of the importance. It's not about NATO being sclerotic. All bureaucracies, even bureaucracy at GPF, and we're a small company, all bureaucracy is sclerotic. That is the nature of bureaucracy. The issue with something like the Middle East is that a lot of the member states of NATO, it doesn't matter to them, so they don't have to actually unify over a thing. You can have all the interoperability you want in the world. You can have interoperability, that's an incredibly hard word to say, until the cows come home. The issue is, all it takes is one country to say, no, you can't actually use our sovereign territory for this specific threat because we don't recognize this as a threat. And all of the interoperability goes out the window. So again, we really have to think about NATO as a military alliance. And a military alliance means when one country declares war, all the countries declare war. And the issue is, when NATO was founded, and for much of NATO's history, it was designed with the enemy as the Soviet Union. And if/when the Soviet Union makes its move, all of these countries will declare war in unison on the Soviet Union, and we'll have World War III. When you get to the point where that's not on the table anymore, and suddenly you have a group in Afghanistan called the Taliban, which, I mean, what's a good example of a small NATO country? The most recent country that was welcomed into NATO was Montenegro. And actually, it was very funny when NATO announced this, because NATO was like, this is going to fix it. We're going to bring Montenegro, and this is really going to solidify the alliance. Let's say that Montenegro was part of the NATO alliance right after 9/11, right after the US invoked Article 5. You're really telling me that Montenegro has a similar view of what's going on in Afghanistan as the United States? It shouldn't. It absolutely doesn't on a strategic basis. That's when you start to see that NATO looks sclerotic, right? Because there's this mismatch of interests.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't disagree. I think what the real question is does it matter if it's not so good at dealing with small peripheral threats where everyone's going to disagree, or if the goal is to still keep everything in place for the potential for a bigger conflict in the future? And the secondary goal, I would say, is to prevent, which is a core U.S. imperative in our view, is to prevent Europe from remilitarizing in a way that a dominant hegemon on the continent could emerge.
It doesn't matter as long as there is a unified sense of who that big conflict is going to be fought with. All the little stuff and all the brush fires don't matter as long as the big enemy, there's agreement on what the big enemy is, and we're going to let bygones be bygones and do everything else. If there isn't agreement on the big enemy, then that's going to reflect itself in all the other things NATO does.
Not only is it sclerotic, but it's emblematic of a time that no longer exists. Right? It's frozen in time, as we like to say. And I'm going to quote Mr. Stoltenberg here in his article. And he says, I quote, "Because we face the most unpredictable security environment in a generation, international terrorism, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, cyber attacks, and, of course, a Russia that has used force against its neighbors." So he does talk about what we said, these peripheral things, international terrorism, but he's also really still harping on Russia. I guess, in your opinion, if you're NATO and that was your reason for existence, like, of course you're going to keep falling back on that horse, right? You're going to use that as a refrain nonstop. Are you not? It's part of your DNA. It's why you exist. Like, how can you shake that?
I think I think he's also just looking at, if there is a major threat, it's going to come from Russia and its periphery. So he's just keeping the door open for that.
Well, what I would say, though, is, first of all, in that list that you just read, in that quote, the only thing new there is cyber attacks. Everything that he says is completely unprecedented, has been happening for the last 50 years, for the last 100 years, however many years you want to go back, terrorism and this, that, and the other thing. These are not new things. But second of all, and I guess this is where I would throw the curveball, sure, Russia is still aggressive, and a number of NATO countries, a lot of them in Eastern Europe, but not exclusively there, still worry about Russia. And as Philip said, NATO still serves a deterrence function for some of those countries. The number one question about NATO for me is, what is Turkey's relationship with NATO going forward? Because it seems to me that when you look at the internal divergences of strategic interests, yes, Germany is very uncertain, and we have to start thinking in terms of what are Germany and France doing on the continent right now and how are they organizing their affairs. But for me, the number one challenge to NATO is, how does Turkey see the world? On the one hand, Russia is not a Turkish friend. Those are historical enemies that go back a long time. On the other hand, when Turkish power expands into areas, it goes into Europe.
Yes.
You're already beginning to see those clashes. How is NATO going to deal with that? I've raised this once or twice, just sort of in passing, but when you think about the European Union and what might be able to save the European Union or save some of these institutions that we talk about all the time, it's a common enemy. And I can't help but wondering, if Russia is on the decline, and if we're right about Russia, if that common enemy is actually in NATO right now, if it is Turkey, if Turkey's going to elections this weekend, what if Erdogan sweeps in and Turkey becomes even more Islamist and even more aggressive and builds up its defenses even more?
Sorry, but let's not forget, too, when Turkey expands its power, it also expands into areas that Russia considers its sphere of influence as well. So that kind of throws a kink into it. And I think if you're Russia, too, you see Turkey's participation in NATO notwithstanding, it's also doing everything that it can to build up its own indigenous arms industry as well, which is not totally excluded from like the NATO framework, but it also just it builds sort of an independence that some countries don't necessarily need. So there's a lot, I don't know, there's a lot going on there too. So I don't think it's quite as simple as common enemy, but that's just me.
Well, military alliances are one of those few things that are black and white. Either there's an enemy or there isn't an enemy.
Yeah, sort of. But I mean, the military alliances still rest on political will, even within NATO. I mean, that's one thing that Stoltenberg pointed out in his article, is that, you know, they've had, even during the Soviet era, major disagreements that affected willingness to throw in resources and participation and so forth. But I agree with your point generally.
I don't love hypotheticals, but let's throw two hypotheticals on the table. Let's say the first hypothetical is 15 years from now, Russia invades Poland. Does NATO come to Poland's defense 15 years from now, based on how interests are diverging in Europe? Second hypothetical, let's say that Turkey and Russia, either directly or via proxies in Armenia and Azerbaijan, fight a war for influence in the Caucasus. Does NATO intervene on the side of Turkey if Turkey's trying to expand power into the Caucasus in 15 years' time, or no?
I don't know. It also depends if U.S. is still de facto calling the shots, if the United States is still participating in NATO as it is today. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting.
But I think that's really the reason that op-ed is so striking. And the reason that it strikes a chord with me is because when you're thinking about various scenarios, and those two scenarios I threw out just so we don't get attacked on all different sides, that was completely hypothetical. I have no idea if that's going to happen. I'm just saying those aren't crazy questions. 15 years ago, those questions would have been crazy. If you had pushed those two scenarios, you guys would have both laughed me off the podcast and I would have never appeared again. Today, I asked that question and we go, we have to think about that for a second. So just the fact that we've had that massive sea change, that's what that op-ed is saying. It's like, we can really see some strategic divergences. And if NATO countries don't get together, if they cannot define a common interest, there's nothing set in stone that says NATO has to exist forever.
It is striking, I would say, how much you've seen NATO, be effective in suppressing remilitarization in Western Europe, to the point where everyone is frustrated. Every administration, not just this one, but previous ones, have been frustrated with Germany and French and everyone else willingness to put in their fair share. But the countries that are actually facing strategic threats, Poland, Turkey, we'll say, they're going forward full steam, and basically they're not really acting as NATO members. They're preparing to look out for their own interests and do what they have to do. And I think the future that you kind of are speculating about, Jacob, it's not hard to see these things, play out in a way where everyone just, maybe NATO continues to exist, but it just becomes completely irrelevant. Maybe someone tries to invoke Article 5 and everyone ignores them, showing that the emperor has no clothes. So,
well, and you're right in that we've reached the sort of Twilight Zone. And it didn't just start with the Trump administration. It really started with the Obama administration. I know that Obama and Merkel were great friends, but if you go back and look at when the United States really started putting pressure on Germany to reach that 2% of GDP military spending that generally NATO countries have agreed to, that really started with Obama. The Obama administration was telling Germany very politely, you guys aren't spending 2% of your GDP on military affairs as part of your NATO agreements. You need to live up to that. Trump has been much more brash about that, but it's this Twilight Zone thing where you have the United States is upset at Germany for not militarizing, right? Which you can't even like. Yeah, so on the one hand, the United States wants Germany to militarize, but as soon as a unified Germany becomes any kind of military power, if you think there's disagreements right now today in Europe with the European Union and fear over the level of economic influence that Germany pulls on the continent, just imagine if Germany actually really started taking some of that economic machine and started pointing it towards its military. I think that some of the tensions you're seeing in the European Union right now would skyrocket. So I'm just saying, Philip, that you're right. We're in this kind of Twilight Zone where nothing quite makes sense.
It's similar to what you see in East Asia, with the U.S. periodically throughout history has pushed Japan to do more of its fair share, while also at the same time wanting to restrain it. China has been supportive of the U.S. position in subtle and small ways in the Western Pacific because it doesn't want Japan to go full bore on remilitarization. It is a Twilight Zone. It's sort of a inherently contradictory position where the U.S. wants more from these countries, but also doesn't want things to go back the way they were.
Well, you say contradictory, and that's a really good point I want to touch on. I was going to mention it a second ago. We talk about what Donald Trump wants. To me, that does seem a little bit contradictory. Does he actually want these countries to pony up the cash that they're obligated to do to decrease the United States' financial burden on those? Or does he just want out entirely, right? He hasn't shied away from saying he wants to come out of some of these organizations. He's renegotiating NAFTA, just pulled out of the UN Human Rights Council. Those seem to be at odds, right? Why tell Germany or Macedonia, or what do you care what Slovenia or Macedonia ponies up if you're not a part of it? Like, who cares?
Well, what I just meant is that there's inherent contradictions. Like the U.S. is going to want multiple things that are contradictory, and that creates this sort of perpetual push and pull. It's not the first time that these alliances have become strained.
Well, yeah, and Cole, I would push back a little bit against what you just said, because I really don't think this is about Trump. I really think this is about the United States, and the United States wielding a level of power that is imperial. And if you look back at every single empire, you know this because you've been obsessed with the History of Rome podcast.
I actually just finished it.
You did? Was it good?
Oh, yeah.
Well,
it was great. I mean, if you happen to have 70 to 80 hours just lying around your house or apartment, highly recommended, but we can get back to that later.
We can, but I mean, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but the thing that kills empires is overextension. The thing that kills a dominant world power is that they're just extended in too many different places. And for the United States, this push towards getting some of the allies to take on more of their fair share is, again, born of the same thing that is weakening NATO, in the sense that the United States was fine paying for all this when it was in a battle royale for global influence with the Soviet Union, right? The United States can't. Despite its immense power and its immense wealth, the United States cannot afford to be the policeman of the world everywhere. And none of these countries, which the United States helped rebuild, have been pulling their fair weight, and they are not in mortal danger anymore. So whether it's the Obama administration, whether it's the Trump administration, it could have been the Bernie Sanders administration for all I care. What the United States is seeing is that, look, the Cold War was won. It was won with U.S. money, with U.S. military resources, with all these alliances. The U.S. can't continue to commit itself as if the Cold War is still going on, because it's not. There are myriad challenges all over the place, and the U.S. needs to redefine its interests. And that means, yes, Germany, hopefully you've learned something since 1945. Take care of these issues yourself. Japan, hopefully you've learned something since 1945. Hopefully that Douglas MacArthur Constitution will hold well. Take care of some things yourself. Let the United States go and deal with some of its own issues. I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong. I'm just saying I think that's the rationale, and I think it's not a personal one. I don't think it's specific to an administration. I think that's one of those almost unconscious things that the United States is doing without even realizing.
Yeah, I mean, this push and pull, again, it's happened repeatedly throughout, over the past 40, 50 years. It's not particularly new, even if it's just we're in a moment where it's a little bit more acute, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's fundamentally different. That said, I think, again, there's an inherent paradox to what the U.S. wants. Look at East Asia. It doesn't want to be the world's policeman. It doesn't want to go to battle over tiny little islands that are marginal to U.S. interests. And so it wants other countries to do more. Other countries are saying, we will do more, but we also can't risk provoking a conflict with China if we don't think that you're going to be there. They want to free ride off the U.S., but they also want the U.S. Part of that is probably a desire just to keep reaping the security benefits that the U.S. is providing. But at the same time, they have good reasons to not go all in and try to pick a fight with China if they don't think the U.S. is going to be there. And so the U.S., again, it wants lots of rational things that can somewhat work at odds against each other.
Philip, I think it's a good point, but the thing I worry about in this conversation is that this all gets very political in the United States, and people are going to ascribe a political ideology to what we're saying, even though there is no political ideology. So I want to take a different example, which is kind of a mirror reflection. Look at Russia right now. If you look at the way Russia is defining its sort of defense and strategic policy, even what it's articulating in those terms, Russia is very clearly stating Russia is no longer the Soviet Union. Russia cannot be everywhere the way that it used to be. There are key sectors of the world where Russia must be. So this is the Caucasus. That's why the relationship with Armenia and the Caucasus issue in general is one we watch. This is Central Asia. This is Eastern Europe. The Balkans is there, but even now you're starting to get outside of Russia's interests. The thing is, when you think about the Western media narrative about Russia, you think that, oh, well, Russia is strengthening and Russia is doing this and Russia is doing that. What Russia is actually doing is it's more narrowly defining its interests, and it is pulling back to those places that are most important to Russia and then throwing most of their resources at the most important issues. So there's a reason that Russia spends so much time on Belarus. It's one of the reasons we write so much about Belarus. There's a reason that Russia spends so much time on Central Asia, because that is a key area when you're looking at Russian foreign policy imperatives. The same thing is true of the United States. The United States is trying to more narrowly define its interests. And I just think it's interesting that here are two countries, the two protagonists in the Cold War, and both of them are actually kind of doing the same thing. They're both trying to limit their interests, and the Cold War is no longer the thing anymore. It's more about defining the national interest and defending the national interest. And yet you get completely different media narratives about what both of those countries are doing.
When Phil was talking about, U.S. security guarantees, in East Asia, I was going to bring it full circle and say it's not totally unlike the Kawhi Leonard situation right now, because they're trying to shop him around, but they can't get him. They can't get much for him right now because there's no guarantee that he can go to any team and then after one season say, peace, I'm out. And who wants to blow up their entire roster and give San Antonio the entire farm just for him to be like, okay, I'm out. Now I'm going to Los Angeles.
No, I'll actually play ball with you for a second, because some of the media reports that we're seeing say that Popovich hates the Lakers so much that he doesn't want to trade Kawhi there under any circumstances, because he just doesn't like the Lakers, right?
Well, that's absurd. He probably doesn't like the Lakers, but at the same time, there's always that risk of trading somebody to your enemy, right? And they are historic rival.
Yeah, but this is the point, right? It goes back to political will or trust or these different things, right? There is the interest that a particular franchise or a particular country has. And if you are looking at the Spurs geopolitically, you're going to say, okay, well, the Spurs are just going to go and get the best deal. And one of the things you have to factor into that is, well, actually, the person who controls the Spurs literally hates the Lakers, can't stand the Lakers. So you have this battle between what is in the team's best interest and then what that particular individual with that level of power at a particular moment wants to do. I think it's actually an amazing parable for a question we always struggle with, which is how to think about individuals. In this particular case, and we're just talking about basketball, we're just talking about sports, right? But you have here an individual who there is what is in the best interest of the team and what just the cold logic of geo basketball should dictate. And yet you have this other, and these are no less strategic, things like political will and trust, and whether you want to enable another potential competitor to become even stronger, even if that's what's best for you in the moment. Those are exactly the types of decisions and questions that are afflicting a country like Germany and the United States. The United States doesn't trust Germany. The United States has been fighting wars in Europe literally for almost a century to make sure that a strong Germany doesn't reemerge. At the same time, it's telling Germany, no, like, we'll help you if you want to remilitarize. How do you balance that? There is what is in the US interest, which is the United States not being the global policeman of the world. And then there is this distrust in a country like Germany that is born of the way Germany acts when it's unified and powerful. And that's exactly the question we're talking about. So I think it's not a silly thing, and it actually helps us approach the situation that a leader is in. What if you don't trust another one of your partners at all, but it's what's in your interest? The whole thing that I was circling around at the beginning was the thing that glued NATO together was the threat was more important than all of the little squabbles between them. Today, the threat isn't that important. The threat is not big enough to cover up all the squabbles. And so you can have people like a Greg Popovich, if we're going to extend the metaphor as far as we can. You might have a country that can say, I'm not going to trade Kawhi over there because I don't like them. I don't trust them. And I'm not in mortal danger if I do that. Just like a country like Poland or a country like Germany can say, no, I'm not for this. And I'm not in mortal danger if I don't go along with you. I'm not going to be overrun by the Soviet Union if I don't put my defense spending at 2%, because the Soviet Union can't do that. It's too weak. And so we're going to have this disagreement. And does the military alliance at that point mean anything?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you see, so a country like Australia, which is not really threatened by what goes on in Iraq, it needs its alliance with the U.S. to stay strong because the U.S. is the world's dominant naval power, and Australia relies overwhelmingly on maritime trade for its prosperity. Therefore, it sends troops to Iraq, and so you see countries act in a way to preserve these these structures, but it's still inherently. It is grounded in these. Take a step back, and you'll see what they're actually motivated by, and to see these fundamental interests that they can't act outside of.
Right. I was going to say the things that incentivize them, but also constraint based. Like there are things that they just simply can't do, however much they want to. Right. So that's the other side of that coin. I think we drug that metaphor about as far as it could possibly go. So I don't know if I want to say good for us, but maybe bad for us.
Well, bad for the Hawks.
It's bad for the Hawks.
I'm not a Hawks fan anymore, so nothing you say can actually hurt me. I'm done. I'm done with them. I think I'm getting into soccer,
Oh, you're in the market for a new team?
I am
in the market for a new sport.
You don't want to get into soccer.
Yeah, don't get into soccer. Also, don't get into summer baseball. I know it's a very un-American thing to say, but summer baseball is just, I know that's going to generate a lot of hate mail, but there, I said it. All right. Well, thanks again for joining us. This was a long and spirited conversation at the very end of the week. I don't know about you guys, but my brain is fried and I'm tired and I'm hot, and I'm sure that came out in the podcast. Any parting advice, last words of wisdom for our listeners before we sign off?
I'll just say that, I don't have the luxury of my brain being fried because Turkish elections are coming, and we're firing up for the weekend. We have to keep a close eye on what's going on in Turkey for a lot of different reasons this weekend.
Yeah, it'll buy us another 12 hours. But I guess Sunday night, our time, we're going to be back at it again. Thanks again for taking the time to join us. We'll see you next time. Phil, Jacob, thanks.